Great. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this UNITAR workshop. We are so glad to have you all here today to be learning more and expanding our knowledge on drafting skills. We have Sandy Singer here with us, one of our expert professors, who is also an instructor in the UN-LCP English language program in the United Nations, and he has been part of this program since 2010. He has been also supporting a lot of our training in regards with report writing and drafting skills for the past couple of years. And he also supported different writing workshops in Oslo, Norway, and also the Haiti mission, MINUSTA. And he'll be with us today having these two different sessions, which are independent from each other, but complementary in a way. And we'll be admitting any questions that you have through the workshop in the chat. So feel free to share your questions throughout the session. And Sandy will have a specific time where he will be addressing all these questions. Please, if you can, remember to change your name to reflect the full name and your mission, so we know who's asking the question in particular. And as we said, we'll be running this workshop from 10 till 11:30. So very glad to see almost 50 participants joining us today. Without any more waiting, if Sandy can start with the workshop. Thank you so much, Sandy, for being with us today. Really appreciate it.
And thank you, Pelayo, for that kind introduction. I appreciate it. And welcome everybody wherever you're located. As Pelayo mentioned, my name is Sandy Singer, and it'll be my pleasure today to work on some drafting skills for writing for the UN specifically. When I was asked to do this training, I thought about what could be done in a relatively short span. We only have a total of 3 hours, 1.5 hours each day. So the way I envision it is to provide a series of best practices, tips, strategies, reminders. Some of these things are things you may know. Some of these things are things that will be fresh, new to you. And I'm hoping that everybody will benefit from this fairly rapid review of some best practices for writing for the UN. And when I say writing for the UN, I could be referring to almost any type of correspondence, emails, memos, notes. I could be referring also to report writing. A lot of the things we'll be talking about today are applicable across the board. So the way we're going to run it, as Pelayo just mentioned, is you'll all be muted, but there will be an opportunity after each section to take questions, and at the very end we'll definitely save a few minutes for your general questions. Okay, you have a chat box, as you heard, so you'll be able to write your questions or anything else that's noteworthy. If you need to contact me about a problem, you can write it in the chat box, and Pelayo will be helping me monitor that as well. Okay, so we have, if assuming everybody comes on board, we have 62 different member states represented today, which is quite a number, and people from all kinds of different language backgrounds. And we will, of course, be focusing on English drafting for the UN. Let's get started. I'm going to be showing you a PowerPoint presentation and talking over it, and I will start right now. Everybody should see that. Principles of drafting, best practices and strategies. And let's go straight to it. Second. Okay. Okay, advance the slide. There we go. So that's me. As Pelayo mentioned, I am on the panel of experts at UNITAR and also teach in the regular English language program at UN headquarters, although of course I'm operating from home here in New York City today. And this is what we'll be covering in our workshop today. Audience and purpose awareness. Anytime you might consider taking a course in what they call business writing, professional writing, workplace writing, this is one of the first things that's always addressed. And we'll talk about that briefly. What does that mean, awareness? Formal versus informal language. We'll talk about the distinctions that exist and how you have to gauge which one to use. This next part will take up a major part of today's session. One of the largest, most significant problems that affects UN writing and a lot of workplace writing negatively is wordiness, verbosity. And we're going to look at 8 different techniques, specific techniques for keeping your document shorter, keeping your sentences shorter, being less wordy, as we call it. And the last topic today, we'll talk about something that sometimes doesn't get addressed in drafting workshops. What about long sentences? What about long paragraphs? What is a good average length to aim for? That's today. Tomorrow, and I hope everybody will be back tomorrow to join me, we'll talk about these issues. Tone, using hedges and qualifiers to be diplomatic and tactful. So these two things, these two items go together. And what this involves is different ways to be able to express yourself in a way that you do not offend, insult, burn bridges. And there are different techniques for doing so when sometimes your message is going to be on the negative side or critical side. So this is going to be a very important skill to look at for UN writing, given the need to be, of course, diplomatic. Active and passive is another topic that's addressed in almost any university course that deals with workplace writing, business writing, or professional trainings you might take. And we're going to talk about the difference between the two and how about each can be useful. Gender inclusive language is an extremely important contemporary issue. We'll talk about how that it affects your writing. And last but not least, well, let me go back. I'm sorry, I went too quickly. Word choice and usage will be the last topic we look at, where we look at some commonly confused word pairs and other items that you have to be careful about. So that's the plan. And let's get straight to day 1, session 1 right now. Audience and purpose. So the very first thing that you need to consider anytime you're putting together, beginning to compose a piece of writing is who's in the audience, who's my readership, my primary readers, secondary readers even, and really what is my purpose? So let's examine those carefully. And these are things that I would call preliminary needs for the writer, for the drafter, being aware of these 2 very important key elements. First things first, you have to identify your audience. What do we mean by that? Know, of course, who will read it. Is it one reader, several readers? Are they all at the same level? What do they need to know? The key word here is need. Sometimes a tendency in workplace drafting, UN drafting, is to give too much and really overdo it. But all you really need to consider is, I'm going to provide my reader, my recipient with his or her needs. How much background information do they need? That's a tough one to gauge, isn't it? That's something that you can do in a couple of ways. Sometimes, before you respond to someone, if it's an inquiry, you can write to them and say, and ask them, how much background do you need on this? Do you need me to send you the thread of previous emails about this? You don't want to overdo it without knowing how much background information is actually needed. One of the objectives you're going to be hearing a lot from me today is keep things short, and that means even in email and other correspondence. What do they already know? Well, if they already know a lot, then your message, of course, will be shorter in length. If they don't, you may have to provide more. But this is something you need to gauge, and one easy way is just to be very honest and very direct with your recipient and say, please let me know, how much you need to know about what preceded this. What questions do they want addressed? Of course, you want to try to be thorough. And now we talk about formal, informal versus informal, and polite versus indirect versus direct language. So why does this occur here in the discussion of audience? Well, because much of that choice of what you see on the screen will be determined by who's in your audience. Let's take a look at what I mean right now. There are some people say 3 different styles of writing in the workplace: very formal, very informal, and then something in between, which they sometimes call conversational. So let's take a look at what we have. What will that depend on your selection, your audience? Who are you writing to? Well, if it's a supervisor, a manager, a high official within the organization, we call that upward communication. You're probably going to have to be more formal in your style. So audience recognition is important before you take pen to paper or start typing at the keyboard. Is it a first contact with someone you don't know? That too will often require you to be more formal. You don't know this person, they don't know you. So it'll be important for you to try to stay on the formal side. Perhaps as someone with a cultural background that expects formality. Yes, I think we all know that some cultures have a different approach. We're talking about expectations and formality and courtesy. And if that person comes from a background of that type, and usually you can tell from the first communication with that person, then that might require a more formal style. Now, if it is, on the other hand, someone who's at your level, a colleague at your level laterally, you can be more informal, more conversational in style. And of course, if it's someone who is working below you, if we can use that term below, someone who reports to you is really what I mean. We call that downward communication. And with that person, you can usually tend to be more informal. So be aware of your audience, because that will determine your style and the way your word choice, your wording is carried out. Okay, so you see here, upward, lateral, and downward are the 3 styles that we're talking about, and you need to know who you're writing to for that reason. Contrast these. Give me a moment to take in that slide. So, in this upper example, you are probably writing to someone who's a colleague, or downward communication, maybe someone who reports to you, I need you to send me. But if you are writing to someone who is going to require a little bit more formality, courtesy from you, this would be the way that you might consider wording it. This, I was wondering if, and I would appreciate. These are things that we'll be talking about also more tomorrow when we talk about softening language and softening tone, okay? And I just want you to take a quick look at this last line here. There's a little grammar issue here. Take a look at the wording here, because this is an error that I often see in workplace writing. It is correct. It is not correct to say, I would appreciate you sending me, or I would appreciate him sending me. So if you tend to write that line that in your emails or whatever, keep that in mind, that when you have what we call a gerund here, sending, we use the possessive pronoun. I would appreciate his allowing me to take a leave of absence, or her allowing me. Or here, I would appreciate your sending me. Okay. Anyhow, the point I'm trying to make, aside from the grammar, is that these are examples of more, let's say, informal versus more formal, more polite. Okay. So you can contrast these now. On the left, informal column, on the right, formal. I'll give you a moment to take those in. So once again, why am I showing these pairs? To show you that you've got to decide based on what? Based on your audience. What would be the more proper way for your audience? Certain times you'll be able to resort to the more informal on the left. Other times you'll be required to use some of the more formal on the right. Okay. And now let's talk about purpose. So we've jumped from audience to purpose fairly quickly. These things do go hand in hand. When you are writing a document, I'll let you look at the box first. I won't have to read it to you out loud. It's pretty short. But please take a look at what are the 3 most common purposes for workplace writing. So one thing that you need to do is have in mind, again, this is preliminary to drafting. Why am I writing? What am I going to try to achieve with this, either communication, correspondence, or report? Is my purpose to inform? Is my purpose to request information or help or have a question answered? Or perhaps is it to persuade? Call for action. Now, these aren't the only 3. I'm sure you could think of other reasons that you write for your job. Some of you may have to provide updates. So your purpose would be, I'm going to update my boss, my supervisor, my team. Others may need to alert. There's a serious condition, serious situation, alert or warn. Other times you may need to confirm something. So be aware of why you're writing, and at the end of writing that piece, whether it's short or long, make sure that you've achieved your purpose. Sometimes what drafters like to do is get a little Post-it note, those little yellow Post-it notes, and write on that Post-it note, with this document, I am going to tell Mr. X about issue A, B, and C. And have that Post-it on your desk as you're writing to remind yourself that by the end of my piece of writing, I will have to have achieved that purpose. Okay, we're going to take a look at a couple purpose statements, and I'll even ask you to think about one now. We all have a variety of purposes for writing. I'd like you all to think about that to yourselves right now. Think of something that you've written, whether it's this morning before signing on to this workshop, or maybe last week on Friday or recently. Think about something you've written, whether it's an email, update, a note, a short report. Think about, did you achieve it? Having this as a sort of little template to yourself is a good way to get started, and to double check yourself at the end after you've composed the message to make sure that your reader will have achieved the outcome, will have been updated, or will be informed of, or will know that I need to receive something from him or her. So this is a nice little template, if you can call it that. The wrong word, maybe formula to keep. Let me show you a couple examples. Maybe here's one, for example. So I don't know how many ministers of foreign affairs will be coming in September for the GA, perhaps fewer than in the past, but perhaps you're writing an email already. Here we are almost in August, talking about preparations and updating on preparations being made. So having this in your really present in your mind as you're writing is a good way to make sure that you have done what you need to. And by the end of that piece of writing, this email in this case, the permanent representative will have everything he or she needs to know about preparations being made. Or here's another one. Okay, and again, my advice to you is whatever your drafting task that's in front of you, try to have a purpose statement in the back of your mind, if not even written on a little post-it note to guide you. Okay. By the way, this word here is correct, to be apprised of, apprised, not appraised. That's something we'll be talking about a little bit more tomorrow in tomorrow's session about word usage and commonly confused words. But apprised of here is made aware of, if you're wondering. And it's often confused with appraised, which is more evaluated. Okay. So to wrap up this section, what do you need to keep in mind before writing? Well, first and foremost, and I can't emphasize this enough, position the purpose up front. One of the most common errors that we see every day, and when I say we, people, instructors in our language program, people who work closely with drafters at the UN, is that the purpose gets buried. You just saw an example of a purpose statement, or two examples of them, and sometimes it takes the reader too long to know why you are writing. So make sure you put that in the first few sentences. It should be in your opening paragraph if possible, whether it's an email or a report that you're drafting. Don't, as we say, bury the purpose. Don't have it appear in line 10 of your document. Have it appear early. Anticipate potential questions. That's also a good thing to keep in mind if you're responding or to something. Keep the reader's perspective in mind. And one more thing, a don't. I'm sorry about that. The do's and the don'ts. One more item to show you. Don't tell your reader everything you know about something. Only provide what he or she needs to know. So why is that the don't that I'm emphasizing? Because oftentimes a tendency on drafters is, I'm going to let this recipient know everything I know about an issue, about a subject. But it's overkill, as we call it, and you don't want to overkill. You don't want to overwhelm a reader with information. If someone asks you for something, give them just what they need, not what you want to give them, everything you know. So this is important in terms of, as I said right here above, respecting your reader's time. With that in mind, you're going to see that a lot of what we talked today is about keeping things shorter, not being too wordy, because you need to respect your reader's time. So if you're sending an email and it's half a page or a full page, you want to let that reader know way up front, as I call it, toward the beginning, what your purpose is, and you can be explicit about it. They'll be happier, take my word for it, instead of having to guess what the purpose is. So take away from this, your takeaway, position the purpose up front and early. And the last slide in this section. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Clarify your purpose. Relevant information only, no overkill. And as I've been emphasizing for the entire first section this morning, you really do need to consider both your purpose and audience when deciding how to select, how to organize the content. And one more time, I'm going to say it because it's really as I said, the key takeaway from this part of the training. Make sure that purpose is clearly stated or implied at or close to the beginning of your document. A reader should not have to read, the recipient should not have to read through a lengthy paragraph to get to the reason for your correspondence. And finally, focus on your primary reader when considering the correct tone to imply and proper level of formality So we talked about earlier in a very brief way, formal versus informal language. And, you know, honestly, class participants, that's something that we could spend, if we had the time, a good half hour, 45 minutes talking about. It's important to recognize that level of formality, especially since you write to so many different types of people day in, day out. But I think you're getting, I hope you got the message that the level of formality will very much, and the tone that you employ is very much dependent on who your primary reader is and which way you can lean toward more formal language, such as I would appreciate if you could possibly send me, versus I need you to send me. Okay, I think that wraps it up for this section. Yeah, so before we go to style and conciseness, I will take any questions. If you'd like to write something down in the chat box, we have a couple minutes for questions. Just on purpose and audience, is there anything that comes to mind? Well, you can let me know, please, since my chat box isn't open, and if it is, I'll open it.
Yes, we don't have any particular questions for this section yet, but I would really encourage anybody who has anything to share, any question in particular to this section would be appreciated. If you have any questions, we'll be happy to answer. Yeah,
and there will also be some time at the very end as well. Okay, let me just say one last thing about audience and purpose. If you were to go out of curiosity to a bookstore or go to Amazon.com or wherever you buy books these days and say, okay, I'm going to get myself a good book on workplace writing, workplace communication, writing for the job, I can guarantee you that the first chapter of the book would discuss two things that we've already talked about today, audience and purpose. I can also guarantee you another major section would talk about what we're going to delve into tomorrow about tone and watching your wording. And I can guarantee you that there will be a lengthy section about what we're going to embark upon now, which is how to, different techniques for making your writing clear and concise. So by conciseness, I mean brevity, eliminating wordiness, finding ways to shorten things. And that's what we're going to jump into right now. I'm going to present this in the following manner.
We do have, Sandy, we have one question where
great.
Ismail Dabuda from Botswana asks, how do we find balance between not giving everything you know and anticipating possible questions?
Right, and that's a very good question. Thank you. It is tough. And sometimes what I suggest is when someone has reached out to you, requesting information, that you can write back a brief, polite email immediately saying, you know, first of all, acknowledging the request, and just really being straightforward and saying, I was just wondering if you are, you know, we could use the expression in the loop, right? Or you could use another expression, up to date on this, or would you need me to send you some of the previous emails? And you're going to save both of yourselves a lot of headaches and time by doing that, because that way you'll know how much the person is already, as we say, in the loop, up to date on the situation at hand. The other thing you can do is, generally speaking, try to lean toward being more concise and shorter. And then if the person on the other end, recipient, requires more, he or she could then tell you, because unfortunately the tendency is to overdo it, to overwhelm, and as a result you sometimes get emails and even report updates that can go on, and when you do that, you're not respecting the reader. So I guess those are the two best pieces of advice I can give. One, get in touch with your recipient in advance, find out how much he or she knows already. And two, lean toward, err on the side of keeping it shorter rather than overdoing it. Okay, I hope that helps. Any other questions, or was that it for now, Pelayo?
We do have a couple more, and we have
take two more.
It's three more. We can address them after in this other section.
No, I think we have time. We can do it now.
Yeah?
I think it's better. Yeah.
Great. So we have one of our participants, Luz Rooney, asks, how can you anticipate an audience when you write a report for the United Nations Human Rights Council?
Wow, that's a good question. Well, it depends on what level you're writing to, what the level is of the officials. And that's why it's good to find out in advance, who will be reading this. So generally what we say in our report writing courses is that you try to gear it to the primary reader, the person who's really going to be reading and using that information. Now, someone may be copied on that who is not a primary reader. So you can't obviously gear it to every single person on a distribution list, but if you know who your primary reader or reader is or readers are, that's who you would try to gear it to. So when you say Human Rights Council, Geneva, we're talking about a large group of people, and it would be important to try to identify level of the individual who you're writing to. Next question, Pelayo.
Yes. So we have another question that mentions that Ms. Nina Bajens from UNDP states, I write for internal communications channels for the UNDP. The purpose is to present topics in a more commercial or less complicated way. She works in the private sector. However, sometimes this kind of commercial language isn't perceived well because it's too informal. How to balance these two, like this dichotomy?
Right. So it would be interesting for me to see an example of that, about what you mean by commercial. But basically, I see the point. I think that the UN expects a certain standard as a let's call it international organization, a public organization, public system, not private sector, and so you would have to be careful about sounding too commercial. I could see why that would be the case, of course. But on the other hand, I think that there's a way to achieve everyday language and simple English, which we actually are going to talk about today. It's coming up in the next section. So I think what I talk about when we get to the slide called Plain English Campaign will help that participant. Okay? And I can take one more question, Pelayo.
Yes, we also have a question from Esma Nakevia, and she's asking, is any specific formal languages, vocabulary, which we can use for reporting?
Is there any meaning?
A specific, like vocabulary that we can use for report or formal language.
Right. I do have something available, sort of a worksheet, if you can call it that, a handout, which I can make available to UNITAR, which we can distribute at some point for those who want it, or even if people want to get in touch with me after the workshop by email, I could send it directly. Something that might help, it's sort of a word bank. It's taken from a very good workplace correspondence book. And I can make that available, sure. It uses, it basically has a lot of the, as we say, key phrases that are often used in formal workplace writing. The UN itself does not publish such a list or make available, but I guess it is something that I have that I can get a hold of and make available, okay? And again, just dealing with formal versus informal language. Okay, I think we'll move on if that's okay, but anybody who we didn't get to, I'm happy to, at the end, I think we're gonna have a few extra minutes toward 11:20 or so for final questions, and I'm happy to field them. So let's continue on with the section on clarity and conciseness. The first 8 items you're gonna see now are about ways to be concise, and this is something I can't overemphasize as a key way to improve your writing. Many writers tend to overdo it and be wordy and maybe repeat themselves without even being aware of it. So those are some of the things we'll be addressing right now. We'll start with tip number 1. I'll let you read the slide yourself. Here's an example of unnecessary repetition, redundancy. Redundancy is basically repetition. Saying the same thing twice. Well, if you take a close look at this sentence, we've got 2 assigned groups will collaborate together. All sounds good. On all aspects and facets of the investigation. Well, basically, if you really stop to think about it, when you collaborate with someone, you are working together with that group. So there's really no need to have the word together in there. It's just an example of redundancy. And aspects, facets, also equal each other. They are the same thing. So really all you needed to do on that, just in one example of how even in one little sentence, you can have a couple of different cases of repetition and redundancy, which just aren't needed. So the first thing to be aware of, language tip number 1, is avoid unnecessary repetition. Be careful about it. I have seen sentences written in reports such as, or in emails, something to the effect of, we intend to meet all goals, objectives, and targets. And there's an example of redundancy done the same thing said 3 different ways, basically, or sometimes goals, aims, and targets. There's no need to overdo it. Keep it short. The most basic way is watch out for unnecessary repetition. You'll see more examples now. What do you notice in the following? I'll take a moment for you to take a look. All very fine phrases except for one problem. They're all redundant. Why? All histories from the past. So all you needed to say is history indicates. All benefits are desirable. They're good things. So there's no need to say desirable. If you're in close proximity to Grand Central Station and the Chrysler Building, if you work at UN headquarters, as many of you do, you're nearby, you're close by, you're close, you're in proximity, yeah, but close proximity, that means the same thing. If you're in proximity, it means you're close, so you don't need to say both. So watch out for that type of thing. And this involves joint cooperation. Well, anytime you're working with someone else, you're working jointly. So again, this is redundant. So all you need for these 4, history indicates, benefits, either close or close by or in proximity, but not the way you see it. And finally, cooperation. Let's move on to tip number 2. Oh, sorry, this is a continuation. One last example, I'm sorry. Take a moment. And maybe I can get a volunteer, someone out there who would like to just, unmute yourself, mention your name first, and say, what could I do to combine these 2 sentences? Would anybody like to say that out loud for us, announce your revision of that one? Anybody out there? Palayo, if you want to call on somebody, if anybody lights up.
Yes, please. If somebody wants to raise their hand, I will be keeping an eye and unmuting. There we go. We have
Azima?
The UK mission.
Hi, Azima. You want to tell us what you could do with that to shorten that, those 5 lines of 2 sentences? What would you do?
I would say the director of mission support called a meeting with all section chiefs to obtain guidance on how to diffuse pre-election violence. between rival parties.
Well done, exactly what I wanted. As you see, as you noticed, Alma, there was clearly unnecessary repetition there, and you'd be surprised how often this occurs. Let's move on and go to tip number 2. There we go. Okay, another very common reason that reports get longer and emails get longer than they need to be is unnecessary heavy phrases. I put here on this slide 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 common expressions. And we're going to take a look at much shorter alternative substitutions. Here we go. Instead of saying due to the fact that it's hot today, we can just say because it's hot today, since it's hot today. And I'm referring to New York City here today for those who are in the area. You know it's a hot one. If you say the response we received was along the lines of what we were expecting, all you really mean is like what we were expecting, similar to what we were expecting. In regards to your previous request, well, that's a really common one. All you need to say is regarding, or I'm writing about, or concerning your previous request. At the present time, it is 10:41, New York time. Just use one word, any of those 3 will do. And this is a tendency that is really applicable in workplace writing, whether you're in the private or public sector. Go for shorter. If you can say something in 1 word, as you see here, rather than 4, go for the shorter alternative always. The next one, very common. Despite the fact that peace talks are not progressing, or in spite of the fact that peace talks are not progressing, okay, the special representative will be meeting with both parties immediately. So instead of saying all that, although peace talks are not progressing as expected, okay, there will be no further action until such time as both factions lay down arms. Well, you can just say that in 1 word. There will be no further, etc., until both factions. And violence, there has been an uptick in violence during a period of 3 weeks. Why don't you just say instead during 3 weeks, or better, for 3 weeks. Instead of saying during the month of July, just say in July, during July. But these are just examples of wordy, heavy phrases with shorter alternatives. And on this too, by the way, I have a very good handout, as I like to call it. In this case, that would be something that I could make available to send to you by email if you want a lengthier list of some of these, so that you can see some good reduction. Now I'll give you a chance, try your own, give you about 3-4 minutes, everybody. I hope you have a pen and paper ready, and let's see what you do with these. What can we do to shorten and save words? I'll give you about, let's see, my clock says 10:44. We'll give it about 3 minutes till 10:47 to see what you do with these, and then we'll hear from you. Every one of those, you can save words, be thrifty, cut, short. And by the way, let me just make this clearer. Some of them you just have to cut a couple words, okay? Others you can just replace with 1 word. I'm looking, for example, at the first one, all around the world. I can think of 2 alternatives right now, each of which is just 1 word. See if you can think of those. We'll give it 2 more minutes. And 1 more minute. Okay, I think that most people are probably ready to go on this. So rather than call out to participants, since it'll take a little time, I'll give you what are some of the options that hopefully you came up with. And if you came up with another, then we'll open up to your questions if you came up with something different. All right, so that's how we'll do it, I think, just to be able to expedite things. For the first one, you can just say worldwide, all one word, or globally, on a weekly basis. Weekly, think about it. We will provide updates on a weekly basis, just say or write. In this case, we're talking about writing in the workshop. We will provide updates weekly or weekly updates. This next one, very formal and overly wordy, when all you really need to say is we feel, we believe, or even our opinion is. Our opinion is. 3 words, better than 6 words, our opinion is, or 2 words, we believe, we feel. Right here, all you need to do is cut these 2 words. Face the facts. Face the facts. And same thing here, all you need to do is get rid of these middle words during the negotiations. You've got 3 extra words that add nothing to the meaning. So that's how you have to think about these things when you're writing. Can I cut things that are not adding value? During the negotiations, there was a great deal of heated discussion. It's the same thing as during the course of the negotiations, there was a great deal of heated discussion. And finally, let's see if anybody got this one here. I wanted you to replace these 4 words with an adverb. Adverbs, you recall, are words that end in ly. So if you said for this one, decisively, just add an ly there, and you've got yourself a shorter solution, an alternative. And I see a question from Azima. Sure, go ahead, Azima. Do you have a question there, Azima? You can unmute yourself. It says that you raised your hand. Yeah? No? Oh, maybe not? No? Okay. Anybody have an alternative on any of these? You can open up if you do. No? No posts, Pelayo, we're good to go?
Yes. If
okay,
anybody doesn't raise their hands or more questions.
Okay, I thought I saw a hand up. Let's continue then. Great. And let's move on to the next tip. We'll try to get through all of these today. Number 3, delete filler words and cliches. Take a look at the 4 bullet points. I'll say something about them afterwards. What is a cliche? Well, French speakers out there may know, and of course many English speakers as well will know this word because it is used in everyday English. Means an overused expression, expressions that really are too commonly used and aren't really valuable. It's overdone. So the first 2, of course, are some of the most, are 2 of the most common ones. And as I always like to joke about this first one, if it's really needless to say, then why are you saying it? Why are you writing it? Okay, so don't use that. Even this is really extra unnecessary. And then you have to also be careful about a lot of adverbs. Adverbs, I just mentioned earlier, are words that end in ly usually. I'm going to show you an example in the following slide of how these words can clutter up a sentence, okay? And finally, this last one, adjectives. The word particular is overused. You know, in this particular instance, all you really needed to say is in this instance. In this particular arrangement, in this arrangement. No need to use that word, it's extra. And here's an example. Compare A and B. Well, we won't take a poll on this because it could be a little time consuming and we have a very short amount of time. But if we took a poll, I sure hope that of the 69 people, 68 people out there, that most people would prefer this one. If you really stop and compare the two sentences, I intentionally inserted 3 overly, let's say filler, as I called them earlier, filler words, actually, basically, and particular. And you really don't need any of them to get the point across. Look at the difference in length between this sentence and that sentence. So by this point, participants may be saying, okay, I save a word here, here, I save a word there, but in the end, is this really going to help me? And my answer to you is a resounding yes. It will help you, because if you write an entire document, draft, full of sentences that have these fillers, like actually, basically, particular, instead of going for the shorter approach, your document will get longer and longer, and your reader will lose patience. You've got to respect your reader. We started this workshop by talking about respect for your audience. The reader just needs to know that peace building involves political will more than it involves ideology, or if you could say, if you want, you could add a word or two here and say then specific ideology, if you want to add a word for clarity. So I hope that you preferred B, which is the shorter alternative. Shorter is better when it comes to workplace writing. Okay, tip number 4, beware of sentences that start with those 2 words. Compare A and B. I don't need to read them to you. I think you see it. And I can just take an example like today and say, oh, there were 69 participants in my workshop, versus saying 69 participants. There were 69 participants, or 69 participants were. You don't need the there. So this is a very common occurrence of wordiness. Same thing with it. Oh, I'm sorry. There you go. We're talking about Syria in this example, border with Turkey. It is the border crossing at Bab al-Hawa, which is the greatest concern at the moment. Well, why not just get right to the point? The border crossing is the greatest. You see what I mean, class? So you've added so much, all because you have started the sentence with it, when really you don't need to start that as the subject of your sentence. You know, in general, what we like to say in English writing is think of sentences quite often as, you know, subject, verb, object, or subject, verb, complement. So right here in B, we start with the subject, the border crossing. We go to the verb, is, and then we say something about it to complement the greatest concern. You don't need to start with one subject and another subject. Next up, tip number 5. We're moving along nicely. Combine, reduce, and condense adjective phrases and clauses. So a lot of times you got those three words that are bolded, who, which, and that, which appear in mid-sentence. Take a look at A and B and the reductions that appear beneath each one. Why not shorten it to troop contributing countries? Or as some of you may know, those who are involved with the area of DPO, we also use an acronym for that, right? TCC. So acronyms, that's a whole other issue that perhaps we'll have time to address tomorrow or at the end today if anybody has questions about acronyms. But oftentimes you'll see we are grateful to TCC countries or countries that are TCC, that kind of thing. Okay, and the second one, prompted by the crisis which is ongoing. Of course, you can shorten it to ongoing crisis. So the idea here is you get rid of what we call this adjective phrase. Adjective phrase is the who, which, that part, underlined in each, beginning with that, beginning with which, and you shorten it by putting the adjective in front. The troop contributing countries, ongoing crisis. Again, I know this is fairly rapid, but hopefully you're gonna be able to see this in your own writing and a way to eliminate some of these problems they occur. And next we come to something called unneeded commentary. Very common in UN drafting. I'll let you look at the example. Okay, this is something that I'm sure perhaps you'll have questions about when we finish this segment. It's something that is very common in drafting, whether it's report writing, email, SG reports, I've noticed this type of thing. But really, you can be more direct and just eliminate the commentary. We call that meta discourse in the writing world. And just state, as I said, hey, what's your tip? State the fact directly, just say it. Now, if you really need to include yourself, the writer, in the equation, I recommend not using passive, which is what we have here, it has been observed, but just being more direct and saying, we've observed or we have observed, okay? Even that would be better than it has been observed that, but try to avoid some of this, these commentary-like phrases. I'll give you another example or two in the next slide. Here are a few more. If you're writing to someone, you don't need to make an announcement, as I like to say. You don't have to announce to them, okay, you're going to note that, you will note that. It's really not necessary, especially if you do this here, quite a bit in a document. Even that, it just isn't necessary. It can be said that. Just say it, be more direct, get to the point. Don't beat around the bush. Don't clutter up the document with these longer phrases. Even this. So this last one I'm sure is debatable. Many of you probably use this one, but truthfully, overdone, overused. You can just get to the point and say what you want to say. Oftentimes, it is okay to eliminate even this last one. And now I'd like to open that question to you all. Can you think of any others that are like these? Does anybody want to perhaps type in one that you fall back upon, use from time to time? Maybe write it in the chat box and we can have them read out loud. Or maybe questions about these overused expressions of, where in essence what you're doing is you're talking to the recipient. You're sort of saying something to the recipient, almost as if you are adding another layer to what you're writing when you do this. Does anybody have any others that you think are commonly occurring? Anybody? maybe at the end a question will come up on that. I wouldn't be surprised. No comments in the box, Palayo? I don't have my, okay, let's move on. So these are things that are overdone, as it says, and let's go on.
We do have, Sandy, sorry, we have one question that I see here. Do these rules apply to speech writing?
That's a good question. In speech, we have different guidelines, let's say, and I would say that they don't apply to the same extent, no. And I'll give you one example. I've often heard speakers, use expressions like, it can be said that, or going back to an earlier slide, as you may know, as you may or may not know, there are a lot of expressions that are used in speaking, but here we're really focusing only on writing. And in writing, the goal should be keep it shorter and avoid this, as I like to call it, extra layer that you're adding by adding these words at the beginning of a sentence. Speech, much more open-ended, much more easygoing, I would say, in terms of what you can or can't do. Good question, though. Yeah. Any others, or shall we move on?
We do have another question. We have a question from Hari Alawi, and she's asking, how do you balance direct without being or sounding rude?
That's a very good question, too. That's something we are really going to address in tomorrow's session. We're going to be looking at direct, indirect, and techniques for making things sound less rude. That falls under the section of the workshop called Tone, which is in part 2. And I'm going to be providing an actual, just like I'm doing today, 7 or 8 tips. I'll be providing several different techniques, specific techniques for doing that. So I'm going to save that for tomorrow. I hope you'll be with us, to the participant who asked that question. Yes? Yeah, it's definitely one of the main focuses of session 2 tomorrow, Tuesday. Okay?
Yes, and we have just a couple comments of other expressions to avoid using.
Great.
Like the section described below, I would like to recall, it goes without saying, as we mentioned during the meeting, as you can see. So those are some examples that our participants have been sharing in the chat.
Right, great. I would definitely not use it goes without saying. That's a good example of unneeded. As you can see, I would say is very similar to the 3 that you see on the slide in front of me. I think we can live without that as well. It's like adding an extra layer of talking to the person you're writing to, almost, addressing them. Can you mention the other ones one more time, Palayo, one at a time, please? If you could repeat the other ones.
Yeah. We have the section described below.
Yeah. Oh, that's okay. You go ahead.
I would like to recall.
Yeah, even that. I would consider that over the top. Or even, I would like to recall, again, it's just commenting on what you're writing about, what you're trying to communicate. And I think it can usually be done, dispensed with. Yeah. Any others?
As we mentioned during the meeting?
That I would say is very keepable. Keep that in, because that's something that's different. That's something where you're just reminding someone of a specific point that came up. So I would say that doesn't fall under this category. I think that's not only is it commonly used, it's often needed, and often a very good, as we say, bridge expression to lead into a point. Okay, good. I'm glad that those questions came up. I think we'll move on then to the next section. And we're getting to the end of the concise language. Number 7. So if you have a pen and paper handy, or wherever you keep notes, perhaps on your phone, please mark down. You don't have to write out the whole link here, but just put plain English campaign. And it's something that I recommend that everybody check out when we're done with today's session, or whenever you have some free time at work or at home. I'll repeat that, plain English campaign. It's a very good website. It started in the UK, but it is about both American and British English. And what it talks about is the necessity in today's world to write in a plain, simple form and not necessarily reach for the longest, most sophisticated wording, because the trend, and when I say the trend, and I'm talking about, I don't know, I've been personally teaching business writing and workplace writing for 20 plus years. I can say this since quite a while. The trend is that in both the private sector and the public sector, to go for the simpler term when you have the choice. You don't need to impress by resorting to longer, more sophisticated wording. If you go to the Plain English campaign, you're going to find a lot of great information about this. But let's look at the example first, and then I'll say one more thing about the campaign. Okay, about the website. Compare these two. Well, the first one is a beautifully written sentence, no problem at all. It is imperative that all parties find the means to resolve the conflict. But frankly, it's a little bit more formal, a little longer. It uses words like it is imperative that resolve, when truthfully, find the means, when really all you need to say is what you really mean was all parties must find a way to resolve the conflict. So the question is must better than is imperative that, or is imperative that better than must? And what I would like to argue today, and what the Plain English campaign argues, is that truthfully, in this day and age, your readers will be just as happy reading it as the second version in simpler, plain English. So with that being said, there's a lot in the website, and what I recommend is that when you open that up, again, just Google Plain English Campaign, go to the column or the drop down that says free directory. I think that's what they call it. I'll follow up, and in fact, I'll make a note to myself now so that for tomorrow's session, I'll let you know exactly, but I believe it's called free directory, and you'll find a couple glossaries of plain English versus more sophisticated wording. It's almost like a dictionary they set up. And there's also a very good general guide to writing in there, another free directory. So I'm going to make a note to myself that I'll get the exact drop down and show it. Or even if we have time at the end today, I can share a screen with you on that. But you'll find some useful information there. And the bottom line, the takeaway from this tip number 7, and from that website is what I wrote here above in bold, simplify. Plain English is fine. You don't have to overreach. Don't feel that because you're writing for the UN that everything has to be in the most formal, most sophisticated language, when all you need to do is try to communicate. That's what it's about, communicate. And our last tip, number 8, noun to verb transformation. So sometimes meaning gets obscured or lost when too many nouns end in these 4 endings. You see them there in bold. And when you have a lot of words that end in these 4 suffixes, as we call them, the sentences get longer, and the document does as well. It reduces readability, makes it harder to absorb the message. And now we'll take a look at what that means in an example. Well, sometimes you might have this expression. Well, first let's take a look. All 4 examples here. You got a TION word here, a TION word here, SION word here, and another TION here. All of these refer to actions, verbs. So one thing that you can do to shorten your documents and get more direct in your message is just shorten it to one word. In this case, instead of saying we will ask both parties to carry out negotiations, we can just say to negotiate. This is essential for the resumption of services. This is essential to resume services. UNICEF will see to the provision of kits. UNICEF will provide kits. You see what I mean, participants? And finally, we have come to the realization that our efforts are in vain. We realize that our efforts are in vain. So what you have in each of these examples is a noun being transformed to a verb, noun to verb, noun to verb, noun to verb. All right, now I'll give you a chance to practice with a couple. Here we go, everybody. If you have a pen and paper handy. Give you a minute or two. And on this, again, I think we'll open up the microphones, the unmute, and ask for a volunteer to take number 1. Anybody who wants to. And a volunteer to take number 2. Our objective is to improve the sentence merely by reducing the underlined sections to a verb.
Please raise your hand if you want to volunteer.
Anybody like number 1? All we need to do is take each of the underlined sections and replace with a verb.
Hadia, I'm gonna unmute you as volunteer number 1.
Thanks, Hadia. Go ahead.
So the first one can be, we will shortly decide on how to implement the aid of delivery.
Perfect. That's your solution. Well done. And not only is the sentence more direct and active and, as we say, punchy, right? It gets right to the point. You have shortened it by quite a bit. You can do your own word count if you want to see the difference just by substituting decide in the top line, as Hadia did, and implement on the bottom line. Good. And can I get another volunteer on number 2?
We have Lenas Abdullah from UNDP. If you can please go ahead.
Great. Go ahead, Lenas. Hello.
Hello. Talks are being held for the extension of the deadline to avoid further flare-up of violence. You can just say talks are being held to extend the deadline to avoid further flare-up of the violence.
Exactly. Thank you. Exactly what we wanted. And so you see here a couple of examples of short ways that you can shorten the sentence just by thinking about maybe I'll avoid those TION, SION words like we see here, which we call nominalizations, by the way. It's something that comes up in writing courses quite a bit. Good, let's move on to, I believe that wraps up the section on concise before we go to our final section today. Let me see, yeah. So let me take questions on concise language now because there's only 2 or 3 more things to cover today about lengths of paragraphs and length of sentences. Does anybody have any questions on the 8 tips that I provided on concise language and the necessity to edit yourself? That's what it all comes down to. You've got 8 tools now, right? 8 techniques that have been illustrated. And now, of course, it's up to you when you write a draft document to spend a little time at the end and say, let me go back and see if I can cut here and there, save a few words here and there. Any questions on any of the 8 tips that have been given?
We've had some questions before. I'm gonna start from the last one that we left and responded.
Sure,
Esma asks, usually people using unneeded words or sentences to look more smart or formal. Most of the time they don't know about all these tips. Do you think to avoid this, we need to provide basic drafting skills workshop?
Okay, I'll tell you, this is one of the things that we always, for that reason, include in all our writing classes, courses at the UN headquarters, and even in workshops such as this, which are briefer. It is a commonly unknown thing. It's a common practice. And if you remember at the beginning of the workshop today, I said that this whole workshop today and tomorrow is about some best practices and tips and reminders. And I think it's important for everybody to keep in mind that in fact, the tendency, especially when you're working in an organization, a high-profile organization like the UN, you want to sound sophisticated. You want to sound like you have the vocabulary at your fingertips. But the problem is this: keep in mind that there are 193 member states, and not everybody is going to be at the same proficiency to know some of the expressions that you're using, and may have to at times even look up words or expressions that are overly sophisticated. But yes, very often the tendency is you want to try to impress by using those overly sophisticated words. But I can tell you, as I said, as someone who's taught professional writing, workplace writing professionally for many years, that it really is the tendency. It's something that we talk about in university courses. It's something we talk about at the UN in our writing courses, that you really should aim to simplify. Plain English is okay. Simple English is okay. Now, it doesn't mean that words have to be super short. It doesn't mean you can't use a complex word or a technical term. But it is something I think that is important to include in courses like this, and as you said, to teach. Go ahead, anything else, Palayo?
Yes, we do have a question. It mentions the emails I received from the UN are mostly very formal, a bit cold, and using quite or some complicated legal wording. Wouldn't simple and short be misconceived? Okay,
so that's something that we get into another area which we call jargon. Jargon, J-A-R-G-O-N. Jargon means the specific technical language for a field. So legal language, of course, legalese is a specific jargon, just as people who work with computers and technology have their own jargon, jargon being the specific language of any given field. So it's, of course, going to be a necessity. So we're not suggesting today to cast aside or discard legalese, legal language. However, I am suggesting that depending on your audience, your readers, if you're using a lot of legal terms, if there is one or if there are some that are complex, you should take the time to include a brief explanation, either in parentheses or an extra sentence. But never would I say, oh, just simplify everything. Legal language sometimes must remain in the form it is, as you're suggesting, participants who asked that question. But there is a way to, if you are using a complex term, include a brief explanation. Okay, next play, anybody, one more?
Yeah, how can we avoid using must or need to? Seniors often don't like us to use this in reporting, which makes writing more lengthy. Any tips for alternative examples?
For must and need to, did I hear that correctly?
Yes.
I mean, there are times when you're going to have to, when you're going to have to be firm. I think tomorrow when we talk about tone, we'll look at some ways that you could get around it and be a little softer, you see? So that we can talk about tomorrow, but one way to do that is, instead of saying, you must or you need to, something like use a little softer expression. Something perhaps like it is highly advisable to, something like that, instead of you must. Or it is necessary. You don't want to say you need to or you must. So there are polite ways to get around that. But there are times you've got to be firm. So I would never say don't use those expressions. What I would say is that be careful who your audience is. If you're writing to someone who's a very high official, you may not want to say, we must receive an answer by Tuesday, 28 July, COB. You might want to soften the language. Something like it would, in a case like that, writing to a high official, perhaps it would be something like, it would be greatly appreciated if you could respond by 28 July, COB, something like that. We'll try to get into that more tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to talk about tone, and some of those questions, some of those word choices will be examined. Okay. I think we have time for just one more question before I wrap it up with sentences and paragraphs. Anybody else?
Sometimes it feels uncomfortable to use to, the preposition, in the same sentence. So the participant who shared the question may use unnecessary words to try to avoid that. That was more like a comment. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And then we have a final question, Sandy. If I write in a report to my boss that we observed that I could be inferring that I'm doing a proactive officer, being a good officer.
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry, Palayo, one more time.
Yeah. If I write in a report to my boss that we observed that I could be inferring that I'm doing a proactive officer, being a good officer. I think this was also a comment, not a question in particular.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right. Yeah, because I can't really add anything to that one. Okay. Thank you. All right. Let's move on then to the paragraph and sentence length. This will be the last segment, 10 more minutes if you can bear with me. Question often comes up, okay, I'm writing reports, I'm writing emails. How long can my paragraphs be? How long should my paragraphs be? And once again, I want to emphasize that you have to take the reader, the audience into account. Readers don't want paragraphs that take up a half a page. Readers want shorter paragraphs. So here's a few guidelines for you. This is a gray area. There's nothing in black and white about this. But one thing that is not a gray area is this. One idea or focus per paragraph. One idea developed per paragraph. Try to have a focus, a topic, and that way you'll end up probably with shorter paragraphs. Main idea toward the beginning, details to follow. Why do I include that? It may seem so obvious. I'll tell you why. Because when you were taught academic writing in the university, you were told to build up to the thesis statement, main idea, and put it at the end of your introduction. Not so in workplace writing. When you are writing a paragraph, start with the main idea, your purpose first, toward the beginning. We don't want to build up to it. You start with the key idea and the details follow, not reverse. Again, we're talking about workplace writing, not academic writing. Next. Now, again, there's nothing in black and white that's a set rule, but it's a strong recommendation. Paragraphs, the shorter you go, the easier it is to digest for the reader. I don't recommend going above 10 lines. I'm talking about lines, not sentences, right? I'm talking about in a block of text in an email or in a report. I've taught courses and workshop trainings like this for different divisions within the UN, DO, DPPA, the HRSD, security, and almost for all of them, we emphasize this. No, it doesn't make a difference what type of writing you're drafting you're doing, but just to keep as a general rule, I'd like you to consider this. Shorter paragraphs are easier to digest. Again, that A never exceed 10. Of course, there's some flexibility, but try to keep that as a, let's call it a guideline, not necessarily as a firm rule. Keep them short. You're better off. Topic sentences. Why are topic sentences important for each paragraph? I'll let you read that slide to yourself. I don't need to say it to you. My point here is that topic sentences are good for everybody. They're good for you as a drafter. If you have that as your lead, your header, and your paragraph, you know that everything you put in that paragraph should be relevant to that sentence. Nothing irrelevant. To the reader, why is it good? Guides them. This way the reader knows what's coming, what the focus of that paragraph is. So it's a no-brainer, as I like to say. Have a topic sentence, just like you were taught to do when you were writing compositions and essays in high school and university. And I think the last slide's coming up. No, we're going to pass that one. Let's go to the sentence length now. And on sentence length, again, There's nothing set in concrete, nothing in black and white about sentence length must be a certain number of words. But the general guideline I'd like you to consider is shorter is better. Keep it short. Emulate the great writers. Average of 20 words or fewer per sentence. Studies show that readers lose focus in long-winded sentences. Yeah. Let me read you something from something called the Readability Monitor. This first quote is about U.S. press associations such as UPI or AP. Press associations in the U.S. have laid down a readability table about sentence length. 14 words, fairly easy. 17 words, standard. 21 words, fairly difficult. 25 words, difficult. And 29 words or more, very difficult. Difficult for whom? Difficult for the reader. Now, that may come as a surprise to you, but this is not the only study that's been done about sentence length. Oftentimes, drafters string together too many ideas and end up with sentences that are 30 or 40 words long. My advice to you, if you're aiming, average 20, saw from what I just read to you, even 25 or so. Here's one more quote from the UK, from the Oxford Guide to Plain English, which offers the following guideline. Quote, over the whole document, make the average sentence length 15 to 20 words per sentence. So the message I'm trying to impart is you're better off, if you're going to respect your reader, to have shorter rather than long, strung together sentences. Don't string them together, as you just heard me say. And this is something else that happens a lot in workplace writing at the UN. I can't tell you how many countless documents I've seen where a writer will have an entire paragraph on an update, a situation report, where you've got semicolon after semicolon after semicolon extending the sentence. Well, I don't recommend that you rely on semicolons. It's just not a good strategy. Instead, just put a full stop, capital letter, start a new sentence. Try to adhere to this average. Don't end up with 40 words in a sentence with semicolons. Respect your reader. As we said in the very beginning of today's training, audience awareness. Audience awareness, what would your audience prefer? Keep your audience in mind. I think that's my final note to you, fittingly, which is the first thing we started with. And I thank you. So I'm going to stop share. Now, I know that we have the 6 official UN languages, but I added a couple that I happen to like, Italian and Portuguese, for good measure. Let me stop share for a moment. And we have a couple of minutes for some quick questions. And we still got 70 people. That's great. Didn't lose people today. Does anybody have anything else that I would like to, that you would like to ask me?
We have one question from Audrey from Canada, who asks, how many paragraphs should a missive have to present a new PR, permanent representative?
Right. Now, with the first part, missive, was it how many? One more time, please, Pelayo. How many
paragraphs?
Yeah.
Should a missive have to present a new PR?
There's really no set limit. That will depend on your office. Oftentimes for these, sort of guidelines that I've been giving, you will have different guidelines, different parameters set by your particular office. So truthfully, we don't have anything concrete written in black and white about that. And that's why I even hesitate a little bit to say, keep your sentences this long, keep your paragraphs that long. These are really more, suggestions than anything else. So I don't have an answer for that, unfortunately. Another question?
People are just thanking you for this great workshop. We don't have any more questions. I would just like to remind everybody that we'll be here tomorrow at 10 a.m. again for an hour and a half with Sandy, and we'll be focusing, as he mentioned, more on like the tone and different aspects of drafting that we haven't covered today. Thank you so much, Sandy, for being with us. I don't know if you have any closing comments.
Sure, just one. Sure, I just want to say that I wish that I had the time to speak to a lot of you and hear some of your individual things that hear about some of the individual things that concern you about drafting. I hope that the Q&A that we're allowing is helpful. But I just want to say that tomorrow we'll be going on to a whole different set of topics, no repetition from today. We'll be talking more about word usage, word choice, and tone. So tomorrow, a lot more about how to write diplomatically. Today, we already had a couple questions about how can I make sure that I'm not too direct, or how can I make sure I'm not rude? Because let's face it, international organization like you all work in, it is a key consideration. So tomorrow we should focus to another key component of drafting, which is being careful about tone and also about word selection, selecting the right wording so that you don't offend or cause harm or create ill will. So that's what we'll be doing tomorrow. So I hope that you will all be back tomorrow with us again. On behalf of UNITAR, I'd like to thank you and thank you for your patience in getting through all that material. I hope everybody has a great rest of the day or evening, regardless of where you are. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, Sandy. Yeah, bye-bye, everybody. Thank you for being with us.